Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, because the story is building up and it's getting very exciting, and it's so great to share these fabulous stories with you. But before we continue, I would love you to, if you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the whole story. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. Dear Freya, if you are reading this letter, I am very likely deceased. Please do not feel sorry for me. I do not need anyone's pity, nor do I want it. I'm in a much better place now, just like the dead bird on the side of the road. This is where I want to be. I assure you I did not take this decision lightly, but thought about it long and hard. So this was not impulsive by any manner of means. I honestly saw this as my only way out, where at last I could find the peace I so desperately seek. And peace has been lacking in my life. It has been beyond my grasp, like a kid trying to reach the candies on the top shelf, but their arm is just not long enough to reach. My arm has never been able to reach any joy in my life. In truth, I would liken myself to a candle with a blunt wick that just cannot be lighted, for I feel dead inside. The fire in me has gone out. Why did I want to end my life, is what I am sure you must be asking yourself, for the idea is probably absurdly incongruous to you. Let's just say it's complicated. From my early childhood, things have been tough for me, for reasons I don't want to go into right now. For if indeed I did, I'd probably need to write an encyclopedia, and I frankly don't have the energy for such things. But trust me when I say, my life has been a living hell. I have not been able to overcome the post-traumatic stress disorder I acquired in my very early life, that unapologetically left its indelible scars in me, that I have been unable to shake off. There was a time for me when I actually did see light at the end of a long tunnel, and my therapy sessions appeared to be working. I thought that at long last I'd be able to come out of the ambiguous fog of my hazy life, but it was not to be, as the trauma I experienced so young as a kid came back to bite me very hard. All of a sudden things spiraled out of control, and I couldn't cope with living in my own skin, and I wanted out. You may wonder why you're sitting in a solicitor's office, and why I would leave a perfect stranger, my beloved Sweet Pea. But on that night, when my world came crashing down on me, you were the one person who was in a bad place in your life that showed me care and great kindness. I could also see a sadness in your eyes, how overwhelmed you were with your lot, just like I was. I could see myself reflected in you. It takes a bird with a broken wing to recognize another bird with a broken wing. I knew at once I had met a kindred spirit in you, someone who, very much like myself, has been shipwrecked more times in their lives than they care to count. I couldn't fix myself, but maybe I could go some way to help fixing your broken wing, and that would help me to depart this earth, feeling a wee bit better about myself. I understand if you want to sell the Sweet Pea, but it would be cool if you could bear to hang on to the place, for it has been my home. I hope too that it can be yours. All my love, your friend, Tina Crosscrow. Freya stared at the solicitor incredulously. I don't know what to say. This is the most outlandish, crazy thing that has ever happened to me in my life. It's like something you'd expect to happen in a novel or in the movies, but not in real life. It is extraordinary, said Mr. Sanderson Parker. But then you know what they say. Truth can be stranger than fiction. You know what, Mr. Sanderson Parker? That is a very good point. I know it sounds awful, but on the night that I met Tina Crosscrow, she had just had her bag snatched. She looked so sorrowful. It wasn't about losing her purse. I knew it was something that went far deeper than that. I remember privately thinking to myself that I'd met someone who's had life worse than I have, and actually feeling in that moment a bit better about myself as a result. And now I feel dreadful for thinking like that.
It is human nature to think like that, I suspect. If we notice somebody's having a greater struggle than we are, our struggle doesn't seem quite so bad, does it? Don't give yourself a hard time about thinking like that. It is what it is.
So then what is the Sweet Pea?
The Sweet Pea is a cottage on a sizable plot of land, situated in the Georgia countryside. Very idyllic, I might add. Tina has left you her cottage with all its contents, along with $10,000 in her bank account. She's left the rest of her money to her brother Zach, which was a sizable amount, I hasten to say. There are 3 cottages on this land. The main house is owned by the Prt3of family, although it was the original house that Tina Crosscrow and her brother Zach grew up in as children. When they got older, they chose to sell the main house to the Partridges. Then, of course, Tina owns the cottage called Sweet Pea, and then there is her brother's cottage known as the White Swan. The land itself is shared freely by all 3 properties. Tina has left the cottage to you, so these are the keys for the Sweet Pea, said the solicitor, handing Freya a key with a fluffy bird on the keyring. Freya took the key from the solicitor's hand with a vacillating hesitancy. The large bird on the keyring reminded her of a finch, rather like the bird that Tina had seen on the side of the road, whom she'd envied for being at peace. How can I possibly accept this, Mr. Sanderson Parker? It's very generous. I mean, what would her brother Zach think? That she leaves a perfect stranger a cottage? By rights, shouldn't the Sweet Pea belong to him? Absolutely not, said Mr. Sanderson Parker resolutely. The Sweet Pea belonged to Tina Crosscrow. It was her property. She wanted you to inherit the property. She was most insistent about this. Does not a deceased person have a right to do what they desire with their things after they are gone? Tina very much wanted you to own the Sweet Pea. It is a gift from her to you. She said giving it to you made her feel better about herself. So I think you should accept this gift as it was intended.
Of course you're right, Mr. Sanderson Parker. I just don't know what to say. This has come as such a shock to me. It was only when Freya had left the solicitor's office, the gravity of what had just transpired had knocked her off her perch. She suddenly realized that she was no longer homeless. She had a cottage in Georgia and $10,000 in her bank account. She could leave her sister's property now and get out of Thornton's hair, and that was a very satisfactory feeling indeed. She could smell her independence like a fragrant floral bouquet. I own a cottage! I own a cottage! She kept saying to herself under her breath. I have my own property now. There was no reason to wait. She wasn't welcome in her sister's home. Not really. She had heard the argument that had erupted in the living room the night before, and the unkind words that had been spoken about her. She knew what she needed to do. She'd leave a note for her sister, and buy her a huge bouquet of flowers and a basket of fruit, and leave it on the kitchen counter, and get the hell out of their home. She'd call a taxi to drive her straight to the Sweet Pea cottage in Georgia, and when she left behind her sister's home, she had a profound sense that she'd never ever have to exploit her sister's hospitality again, and that was a satisfactory feeling indeed. Only a day ago she was having horrifying visions of returning home to Canada, and now here she was, like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, ready to embrace a bright new future that lay ahead of her. Freya left her sister a note saying, Dear sis, thank you for having me to stay at your home. I really appreciate your kindness. I don't want to outstay my welcome. I know I already have. I'm sorry to have put you and Thornton out. I've found a very comfortable place to stay, where I will be very happy, I'm sure. Don't worry about me, Freya. It was at about 6 o'clock in the evening, when fully packed she sat in the back of a taxicab, staring at the front door keys of Sweet Pea Cottage, which for her would open a door to a whole new life, one way or another. She found her frisky thoughts were whirling around her head like the clothes in a tumble-dryer. She tried to focus on her random, serendipitous encounter with Tina Crosscrow, her strange, rather peculiar meeting with a solicitor, and all the oddities that had transpired so far. She felt rather like a character in a novel, playing an idiosyncratic part, wondering where her exciting journey would ultimately take her, through the writer's eyes. Tears began to glisten in her eyes, threatening to slide down her cheeks like lonely raindrops from heaven. She fought them back furiously. She had nothing to cry about. She was in a very privileged position right now. It would seem her whole life had spun around on its axis and was on an upward trajectory finally. It was hard not to get emotional over her good news. She had no idea what the future held for her, and whether she would keep or sell Sweet Pea Cottage. She would live there for a while, until she decided what she wanted to do with the place. She recalled Tina Crosscrow's strange words that she had whispered in her ears before she'd said goodbye to her when she'd left the taxi. "Keep it. Keep it if you can bear to." At the time she wondered what Tina was on about. Tina Crosscrow had clearly decided on their meeting she wanted to give Freya Sweet Pea Cottage, which was why she had taken down all her contact details. Now everything made sense. For so long she had felt rather like a stray dog in a shelter, hanging on to the lost, beleaguered hope that she would ever find a new home. But today, a cottage, by magic, had just fallen into her lap, rather like manna from heaven. But she hoped this gift would not turn to be a pile of maggots. The taxi driver tried to engage in small talk with her, constantly looking at her through the visor mirror, with his curious, beady brown eyes, hoping for a tidbit to be thrown his way, like a hungry seagull, so that he could thoroughly enjoy a good hearty conversation, to nourish the journey that lay ahead of him. But the girl sitting in the back seat wasn't throwing out even a measly morsel of conversation. He noticed she seemed so caught up in her own thoughts. He sighed. This was going to be one of those dull drives, where every minute stretched out like a rubber band. He turned up the radio onto a phone-in program about the horrors people had experienced in online dating websites. People were phoning in to share their own mortifying stories.
"We have Sadie Remington here, who's going to tell us about her encounter with a very unusual individual."
"Yes, it was very bizarre," said Sadie. I met him. At first he looked like an ordinary, very reasonable 32-year-old man. He was wearing a jacket, and we sat down and ordered hors d'oeuvres and everything. And then he took off his jacket, and I discovered to my horror that he was wearing a Superman outfit. Now I ask you, can you believe that? I realized that he was very much into his childhood hero, and he wouldn't let it go at 32 years old. I realized the date from that point was going badly wrong, and I needed to get out of there fast. And believe me, I did. Freya was not listening to the conversation. Whatever was being said on the radio, she didn't notice. She seemed to have turned herself off from the environment around her, as if turning a faucet tightly shut at the kitchen sink. She closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting like a log on the water towards Tina Crosscrow. She tried to replay her brief encounter she'd had with Tina Crosscrow in her head, like pressing the redial on a video recording. She could see the slim, blonde-haired girl, looking so lost and defeated on the sidewalk outside the bar. What could have been so dreadfully bad for her to have decided to take her own life like this? Tina Crosscrow had mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder in her letter to Freya, but had not gone into much detail about that. It would seem that some skeletons from her past had haunted her life so dreadfully that they had swallowed up her desire to live, and like a hungry piranha had gobbled up the meat of the bright future that lay ahead of her, like an unexplored road map. Freya slipped into a deep sleep. Her head bobbed up and down in the taxicab, with the momentum of the car. Drool spilled down the corners of her mouth. She did not notice the taxi driving steadily through the bright lights of the city, nor did she hear the taxi driver cursing abruptly from time to time at some rather atrocious driving on the road. Freya did not observe how dark it had suddenly become,
and how the smooth roads after the taxi had turned off the interstate had become significantly more bumpy. She didn't even hear the taxi driver saying, "We're very nearly there, ma'am." Freya remained fast asleep at the back of the taxi. She failed to hear the voice saying, "Ma'am, we're here. This is Sweet Pea Cottage. Ma'am, we're here. We're here." At first Freya thought the voice was part of her dream, until she felt a hand on her shoulder and jumped. Freya's startled eyes widened in confusion as she snapped out of her sleep with such a start. She almost screamed when she saw the strange face looming over her. Oh my God! They'd just had a home invasion at her sister's house. She had woken up to a nightmare. She trembled. "Take anything you want! Take anything you want!" she cried out. "Please, please don't hurt me!" She lifted her hands above her face, as if trying to fight off any danger. Ma'am, I think you've had a bad dream. You're in a taxi. You asked me to drive you here. We've reached your destination. This is Sweet Pea Cottage." Freya rubbed her eyes in bewilderment. "So this isn't a dream?" she asked. The taxi driver looked at Freya rather strangely, with a bewildered, confounded expression on his face. "No, it's not a dream," he assured her. "You're at Sweet Pea Cottage. You asked me to drive you here. Don't you remember?" "Oh, I'm so sorry. I just was in a very deep sleep, I think." Freya was glad it was so dark outside, that the taxi driver couldn't see that her cheeks were burning with embarrassment, as all the events of the unorthodox day she had experienced came flooding back to her, like a fictitious story in a novel, that she was still trying to digest. "I'm so sorry," she muttered. I just guess I was a little confused and tired, that's all. I thought I was in my bed at my sister's house. I thought you'd broken in. I'm sorry I reacted so strangely." "Don't worry about me, ma'am. Dreams can feel very real at times, and you did sleep very deeply the whole way here. You must have been very exhausted." Freya tried to make sense of her bearings as the taxi driver opened her door and pulled out her suitcase from the trunk. He kindly wheeled it over to the front door for her. In the headlights of the taxi, Freya could see the outline of a whimsical white cottage. She observed wisteria and red roses tumbling over the glossy red front door. Her first impression was that this was a charming little cottage, but given it was dark, she couldn't see very much. The kind taxi driver had bid her farewell. He had waited patiently in his car for her to finally open the door. With trembling hands, the door creaked open. The taxi driver started up his engine, and his car whizzed away after he'd blown his horn, as if to say goodbye. And then he was gone, and everything became eerily quiet. The comforting sounds of a bustling city she was so used to hearing were long gone. She could only hear the sounds of the countryside, the sounds of crickets and frogs. Suddenly she felt dreadfully alone. The cottage was swaddled in darkness. She couldn't see a damn thing. She fumbled awkwardly around the wall for a light switch and breathed a sigh of relief when she actually found one and was able to switch it on, so that a congenial light flooded the entrance hall. Freya sighed with relief. She could barely keep her eyes open. Why was she so exhausted? She felt as if she was caught up in the throes of a deep sleep. But the first thing that hit her so hard, like a punch to the head, was the disgusting putrid smell that greeted her nostrils, which seemed like an ominous welcome. She followed the source of the stench, which led her to a spotless kitchen. The smell was so offensive, it was burning the back of her throat and causing her eyes to water. Then she discovered the foul source of the smell, lying in the kitchen sink, crawling with maggots. It looked to be a deceased raccoon. What the hell was it doing in the kitchen sink? Freya blocked her nose and felt an urgent desire to vomit, but she held back the bitter bile bubbling up in the back of her throat. She fumbled around awkwardly under the white wooden kitchen cupboards and thankfully found some black bin liners. Freya managed, with a pair of rubber gloves she found on the sideboard, to extract the ghastly thing in the kitchen sink and throw it in the bag outside the kitchen window. She would deal with it in the morning, while she left the windows open to air the entire place. This was not the kind of welcome she had been anticipating. It seemed rather foreboding. The smell in the kitchen was, in fact, so revolting that even after the offender had been expunged, it remained for several days. Freya made a brief tour of the cottage from room to room. Everything was pristinely tidy, but there was not much evidence to suggest that the house had ever belonged to Tina Crosscrow. It was almost as if she had thrown everything personal away, as if to eradicate every last trace of her life. It was almost as if she'd never existed. The girl must have cleared her stuff away, discarded it in the tip before she committed the fatal act that would extinguish her future. In truth, the cottage was like a bed and breakfast, a place you might book for the weekend, as it was so perfectly presented, with no personal details to tell you much about the previous occupant. Freya found she wanted to know all about Tina Crosscrow, and why she'd taken her own life. But if she was looking for answers, she wasn't going to find them here in the cottage. Freya found that the pantry was not well stocked. It contained some bags of pasta, packets of cereal, long-life milk, a few random tins of tomatoes and tuna. She managed to make herself a mug of coffee and poured herself a bowl of cereal, which she ate hungrily. She decided she would not be sleeping in Tina Crosscrow's king-size bed tonight until she'd managed to change all the sheets. She found a sleeping bag in the linen cupboard and lay back on the couch in the living room. The smell of death and decay lingered around her. All she concerned herself with now was getting a good night's sleep. Later on in the night she woke up with a start. She'd heard a strange noise. What was that? A slight banging sound. What the hell was that? Freya felt her whole body freeze over as she listened again, but she heard nothing. The cottage was steeped in an uncongenial, formidable, bodeful darkness. She couldn't see a thing. Everything was blacker than black, so much so that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She had gone to sleep on the couch, with the lamps on in the living room, and now they were both off. Had there been a power failure, would she need to check the fuse box? All of a sudden, she had this ominous, dreadful feeling that she was not alone, that something or someone was watching her, that someone was in the room with her. She could feel a tangible presence, which made her entire body prickle in trepidation, and her heart seemed to be booming violently in her chest. "Hello? Hello, is anybody there? Is anybody there? Is anyone there?" she called out. And then suddenly something thrashed itself against her feet, and Freya screamed. It was only then she realized that the thing rubbing itself against her legs was a black and white cat. "Where did you come from?" said Freya fondly, picking up the affectionate cat in her arms, stroking it tenderly. "You gave me quite the shock, you did. Oh, you really did. Where did you come from?" The cat was purring and rubbing itself contentedly against Freya, as if it had known her all its life. "Now let me get some light on in here before I have a heart attack," said Freya, feeling around for the light switch. Freya was surprised to see there had been no power failure at all. How could the lamps switch off on their very own like that? It was more than a little weird. The next few days had gone swimmingly for Freya, better than she could have ever expected. She had settled into the cottage like a duck to water, as if she'd always belonged here. There was no doubt that Tina Crosscrow had eclectic, very good taste, and the higgledy-piggledy mix of furniture married together into the house beautifully, with sumptuous rugs and twee curtains. Sweepy Cottage was exactly how Freya envisaged a cottage should be, reminding her of some of the old cottages she had once seen on a visit to Ireland with her parents when she was in her teens. The cottage boasted large bricked fireplaces and a wood-burning stove. There was even a fireplace in the main bedroom. Freya loved the old-fashioned kitchen, with its yellow walls, its white wooden kitchen units, its flagstone floor, and its old-fashioned dresser with its elegant display of blue and white Wedgwood china, along with a large wooden kitchen table that could fit over 10 people. The obnoxious smell had been dealt with, and she could finally breathe again. She couldn't fathom how that dead raccoon had managed to get into the cottage and end up in the kitchen sink, but thankfully the problem had been sorted. Freya's sister Rainey had been furious with her, just marching out of their lives in the way she did. "I was so worried about you, Freya. I mean, yes, it was nice to get the fruit and the bouquet of flowers. Very thoughtful it was, and thank you for that. But you wouldn't even answer your cell phone.
I thought something dreadful had happened to you. Why did you bog off like that? Just leaving a note." Freya had deliberately not answered her cell phone messages from her sister. It had been so upsetting to hear the couple talk about her the other night, and the way her brother-in-law wanted to kick her out of their home had left her feeling rather wounded. "Freya, are you listening to me?" came her sister's voice. "I was worried the hell about you. But I heard your argument the other night with Thornton, Rainey. I know you didn't want me around, so I'm out of your hair. Why are you complaining? You don't have to worry about me now. For your information, I've got a roof over my head, some money in the bank to tide me over, and I'm going to look for a job. I'll be fine. I promise you that." She could hear her sister chewing her lips. "We both know that's not true, Freya. Please don't be like this." "All right, I admit Thornton does want you to leave sooner or later, but we both want you to get your life on track." "My life is on track, Rainey. I'll be in touch shortly. I'm sorry. I'm still upset. I'll call you when I'm not feeling so peaked." And with that, she had abruptly ended the call, hearing her sister protesting down the phone. Freya, please, don't be like that." Freya's account. My whole life had taken a spin, in a positive direction for a change, to such an extent that I was thrown off course. In truth, I was trying to acclimatise to my change of fortune, which was like being flung from the insufferable perishing heat of a scorching desert to the ice-cold winter freeze of the Antarctic. It was exhausting. In other words, my dramatic, unexpected change of circumstances was an incredible shock, even if it was a good one. Indeed, it was so surreal for me that I was convinced I was caught up in an illusory dream from which I did not want to awaken. I was so used to my life being a perennial struggle, fighting to make ends meet, from one month to the next, that I really didn't see change coming my way, even when it hit me across the face like a cold slap. It takes a long while to adjust to things, and for me personally, I was trying to go with the flow. Like a fish that had been swimming downstream for so long, I was not sure exactly how to turn around and swim in the opposite direction. I was so used to drowning and fighting so much to stop myself from being submerged by life's challenges. I could not believe a random chance encounter with a girl outside a bar, who was even more wretched than I was, would facilitate all this serendipitous change for me. I could see Tina Crosscrow was in turmoil from the very first time I laid eyes on her. She had stood there in her skin-coloured dress on a cold night, looking so dreadfully lost. It was only so sad that my good fortune came out of such tragedy. I was upset that Sweet Pea Cottage gave no hint of why Tina Crosscrow had chosen to take her life. I suspected all such evidence had been binned and discarded by Tina herself before she plunged into that lake to her death. Perhaps she wanted to take all her withering secrets down with her to her watery grave. There were 3 residential properties built on this sprawling piece of idyllic prepossessing Georgian countryside, which the residents shared together. One which belonged to Tina Crosscrow's brother, whose name was Zack. Then there was a couple called Sheila and Ernest Partridge, who owned the main house on the property. I was hoping a meeting with Zack might shed more light on why Tina Crosscrow had so much pain in her life. But I was not sure that Zack would take very kindly to my obtrusive interfering presence on the property, as after all, surely he'd have wanted his sister Tina to leave the cottage to him, not just a random stranger like myself that she'd met outside a bar. I was to discover that not only had I inherited a very sweet little cottage, but also a very old Range Rover car that had seen better days, but still worked reasonably well. I could shop and be on the lookout for any potential jobs that were on offer in the local town. I was hoping moving out here would be a brand new beginning for me, with the potential to make new friends, although I wasn't sure the houses sharing the land with me would extend the hand of friendship towards me. I had decided on the 3rd day to take a long, leisurely stroll around the property that stretched out forever like a large, all-encompassing yawn, as my inquisitiveness had finally got the better of me. I wanted to see White Swan Cottage, where Zack Crosscrow lived, and of course the main house, which was a hunting lodge that could host over 15 guests at a time, that belonged to the Partridges. The Partridges had been good friends with the Crosscrow family, so Tina and Zack had sold the hunting lodge to them, which had seemed like a good idea at the time,
as the beautiful land offered hunting and fishing opportunities for the residents and their guests to enjoy. I clandestinely decided to walk through the wood grove that fringed one side of the road that lightly led up to the hunting lodge and the cottage where Zack Crosscrow now resided. It turned out I wasn't wrong about that. Furthermore, there were fabulous trails through the trees that were in great condition and looked to be well maintained. I spotted a couple of hunting stands in the trees. Sweet Pea Cottage was the cottage at the bottom part of the property closest to the main road. I did know sooner or later I would need to introduce myself to the residents living here, but I felt reluctantly bashful about doing so. I felt that I shouldn't really be here, as if in some way I was an imposter, and the people on this property would likely feel the same way about me. I mean, who inherits a property from a random stranger? It was a beautiful, prepossessing day. Spring was long behind us. The weather was pleasantly warm. The trees were covered in a rich bounty of leaves, but there was just enough light trespassing through their boughs to prettily light up the trail. My walking boots grazed the ground with a smacking sound as my rubber soles pulverized the leaf litter and random twigs beneath my feet. I could hear the pretty bird song up in the trees. I spotted 2 squirrels friskily bounding up the branches of a tree, always staring at me curiously through very dark eyes. I also encountered a mother doe and her speckled pretty fawn, standing stoically under a tree, staring at me, and then they suddenly charged like 2 rockets taking off to the moon. All of a sudden, as I began to walk, I was sure I was not alone. I felt absolutely certain something or someone was trailing behind me, but as I turned around, nothing was there. I scrutinized the trees, my eyes looking for any shadowy movement, but there was nothing. I continued to walk, and then I was hit by a shower of pebbles. Someone was definitely there. Someone had thrown the pebbles at me, and I could have sworn I heard a muted chuckle of some kind. "Who is there?" I called out. "Who is there? This isn't funny. Show yourself. I know you're there." I was beginning to suspect the partridges might have children, and one of them was baiting me. But as I scrutinized the trees, I still saw nothing. I was completely befuddled. I turned around to proceed on my way, and I was showered again by a spray of still more pebbles, and then I heard the muted chuckle again, as if somebody was finding this terribly funny. I was sure it was a kid, so I ran through the trees, bluffing that I'd actually seen the kids, so that I could catch them. It worked like a treat, but it was not a child or any children that I saw, but a tall, shadowy, rather ambiguous being, covered in hair, charging away. And in that moment, I was quite sure I'd seen a Bigfoot. I was trying to make sense of what I'd seen, when a hand patted me on my back, and I let out a loud scream. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.